we talked about food deserts, access to healthy foods, and income inequality. All of these are things that continue to have an impact on racial inequities in our country and local communities. Today, we plan on discussing what housing means in terms of racial inequities. Housing also has a lot to do with food deserts when it comes to racial minorities in the United States. This is because of redlining, a method of segregation. Redlining worked in boosting housing in the U.S., but at the cost of pushing out minority communities from suburbs and into more urban neighborhoods. Mortgage companies would refuse to insure mortgages for African American households, therefore making them hazardous or red. Red neighborhoods were overwhelmingly made up of African American, Catholics, Jewish people, and others in urban communities, unlike their middle-class, suburban, Northern European white counterparts. For example, if African American families were to purchase a house in a predominantly white suburban neighborhood at the time, the value of those homes would decline over time. It was in the best interest of white and suburban neighborhoods to keep African Americans and other minorities separated in their own communities. This not only led to segregation, but also generational wealth disparities between races. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition found that these communities are much more likely than other areas to compromise lower-income minority residents. Because of the lack of availability for loans and insurance, families were forced to settle in less valuable neighborhoods that were more affordable based on income. However, these communities were more affordable because of their lack of access to transportation and other important amenities. For example, these neighborhoods may not have been close to grocery stores with fresh produce, which were likely out of their budget. Redlining as a form of segregation is seen as a method of creating wealth disparities between races. The households in red communities didn't garner worth over time to be considered a valuable asset, whereas the households in suburban neighborhoods could be sold after generations to bring in a sum of money or even be rented out as a property to bring in extra income. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national orientation, sex, and as amended, handicap and family status. However, that did not erase the effects of redlining in this country. Demos, a public policy organization, and the Institute on Assets and Social Policy found that eliminating disparities in home ownership rates and returns would substantially reduce the racial wealth gap. While 73% of white households owned their own homes in 2011, only 47% of Latinos and 45% of blacks saw less return in wealth on their investment in home ownership. For every $1 in wealth that accrues to median black households as a result of home ownership, median white households accrue $1.34. The study also mentions that the Corporation for Enterprise Development finds that more than half of the $400 billion provided annually in federal asset building subsidies, policies intended to promote homeownership, retirement savings, economic investment, and access to college, flow to the wealthiest 5% of tax-paying households. Meanwhile, the bottom 60% of taxpayers receive only 4% of these benefits, and the bottom 20% of taxpayers receive almost nothing. Black and Latino households are disproportionately among those receiving little or no benefit. It's important to recognize that we must actively advocate and support policies which will effectively make progress from the detrimental effects of older systems. This can only be done by recognizing the flaws and misuse of many policies. Housing policies that benefit individuals who don't need systematic aid is similar to that of affirmative action. Many regard affirmative action as an unfair advantage for Black Americans, but fail to recognize that white women were also included under affirmative action on the basis of their sex. Let's analyze the impact on education and housing opportunities. The school-to-prison pipeline is a national trend wherein children are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems, according to the ACLU. Many of the children being fed into these systems from public schools have disabilities, histories of poverty, abuse, and/or neglect. These trends have a lot to do with zero-tolerance policies in early education, wherein a minor infraction of school policies and rules often subjects students to being criminalized by a school resource officer or security. This takes small behaviors that could be handled with counseling service or increased educational support and turns them into crime. The Prison Policy Initiative says that the formerly incarcerated are almost 10 times more likely to become homeless than the general population. They found that rates of homelessness are especially high among people who have been incarcerated more than once, people recently released from prison, and people of color and women. Many of these individuals live in motels, hotels, and marginal housing, which is only a step away from homelessness. In 2018, white males accounted for 29% of the male prison population, according to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics. 34% and 24%, respectively, were Black and Hispanic males. White females accounted for 47% of the prison population, and 18% of Black females accounted for a portion of the female prison population. When the black population makes up approximately 14% of the U.S. population, but 52% of the prison population, there is evidently something wrong. Housing is a topic that can be spread across different demographics other than the formerly incarcerated. Now let's take a look at veterans in the U.S. After World War II, GI Bills were created to aid veterans by creating hospitals, low-interest mortgages, and stipends for tuition and expenses of veterans furthering their education. The government also created Veterans Assistance Loans, predominantly given to white veterans, to secure mortgages. Now, many veterans are homeless, approximately 40,000 as of 2018. According to a report from Apartment List, veterans who served post-9/11 are actually more likely to struggle to afford housing. Nearly 35% of post-9/11 veterans are cost-burdened compared to rates below 25% of older veteran generations. Post-9/11 vets are more likely to struggle with housing affordability. How does this relate to race, though? It has a lot to do with the presence of military recruiters in public education, especially low-income schools. In 2015, the Army's presence in Connecticut high schools showed that Army recruiters spent far more time hanging out in low-income schools than they did those averaging higher incomes. In the 2011-2012 school year, Army recruiters visited a higher-income high school, wherein only 5% of students qualified for free or reduced lunch just 4 times. They visited another school where more than half of the students qualified for free or reduced lunch, more than 40 times before the end of the spring semester. These lower-income communities are also very likely to be predominantly minority students, putting low-income students of color who enlist in the Army to potentially be at a housing disadvantage later in life. Jacqueline Huang researched how gentrification maintains racial inequality in cities and concluded that gentrification in U.S. cities has been problematic for low-income minorities, and not just because new middle-class residents displace poor people. Despite gentrification in some locales, economically blighted black neighborhoods, plus those with growing Hispanic populations, have tended to remain disadvantaged. Building up these communities by providing equitable resources is very important. However, in terms of gentrification, individuals who move into low-income neighborhoods and build them up because they have the income to do so only push out those who have nowhere else to go. This is because the cost of living will increase as the neighborhood becomes more valuable, partially due to amenities, the quality of public education, and taxes. Huang said that these forms of urban change can further isolate poor blacks and Latinos and, contrary to media claims, actually increase racial segregation and inequality. Eminent domain is a power of the government which disproportionately impacts these communities. Eminent domain is the government's right to take private property for public use as long as they offer a sufficient, fair price for the property. In 2005, the District of Columbia city officials wanted portions of land for the National Stadium. They had opened negotiations with 23 of the landowners, but used eminent domain after the negotiations failed, and 10 owners didn't respond at all. Many of the landowners were opposed and felt that the offers weren't adequate, but the city's claim to the land for public use is legal according to Supreme Court ruling.